So we're here today at the QSO Today Expo. It happens to be August of 2021 if you're watching this at some time at a later date. And I'm fortunate to have with me Gerald Youngblood, the Chief Executive Officer of FlexRadio Systems, and also my employer. But we're going to have a little chat about FlexRadio Systems, a bit of history, and a bit of what goes through in the amateur radio world, in the construction and the design, and the stuff that bit happens behind the thought process. I guess a lot of these conversations maybe are tabletop napkin conversations. I've heard a few of them happen at a nice Mexican lunch when I've been down in Austin visiting. So Gerald, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. Glad to do it.
Great. It's good to have you. So one of the first questions we always want to ask, I guess, is this started back in 2003. Is that right? Is that sort of when you have your inception date? Is about the date you called it?
Yeah, that's a date that I count as the inception. That's when the first shipments went out the door, around April of 2003. But the actual work started maybe as early as 1999 with a hobby project. It was just to see if I could build a radio with a PC and a sound card. That's kind of where it started, probably 1999, but it became into reality in 2003.
And was that the SDR 1000? Was there something else before that?
Yeah, that was the original SDR 1000. That was the hobby project, and I wrote 4 articles for QEX called "A Software Defined Radio for the Masses," and that created a lot of interest around the world in the project. And people started asking, "Is there any way I could get a kit of this project?" And I said, "Well, no, that sounds like a lot of work." But around end of 2002, I thought about maybe that would be a good idea. And so I decided to put together 10 prototypes and ask people on my email list, are you interested in one? And I actually asked them to give me some of their background, because I knew how hard it was to support a very early technology product. Got 50 orders that first week. That was probably March of 2003.
And you shipped how many of those when the dust settled? I think it was
over 1,500, and I really was amazed at that. About 500 the first year. All of those built on the kitchen table.
That's amazing. You spun off some pretty good relationships from that project, didn't you? Even today.
Yeah. Many of those exist today. Some of the earliest customers for the SDR 1000 still are involved in one way or another, and they're still customers, and actually turned out to show up in many other places, including the commercial world. I actually have serial number 1. The person who bought it traded it back to me a number of years later and said, you really need to have this. So I want to be sure you have serial number 1. So I mentioned earlier that I started working on this as a hobby back in probably 1999. I'm almost sure that's when it was. And so I started building quadrature sampling detectors and connecting those to the sound card. And so let me see, I believe this is the very first one here. This was the sampling detector card. And you can see it was built on a breadboard. And then I upgraded that to this one. So you can see it has a little bit more circuitry on it. And you bring this was the antenna here. And I don't remember what those were. I'd have to go look. But it has the sound card connection right here.
You know what? Turn that around so we can see the back, because it actually is surprisingly not complicated when you think of it.
Yeah. So that was part of the beauty of it, was the simplicity of the direct conversion receiver. And it probably was this prototype. I was going to breakfast at the Ham Club meets at Waterloo Ice House every Saturday morning. And I was there meeting buddies every week and talking about my wild, crazy ideas, and they told me how dumb it was, and I was pretty dumb at the time. And so I'd bring my prototype and show it at breakfast and talk about what I was doing. And I don't remember. Here's another prototype here. You can see this has wires all over it. A little more circuitry. You see there. And but I think probably when I had this prototype, I invited a friend of mine, Ken Simmons, K5UHF, who later came to work for FlexRadio. And I invited him over, and I connected the antenna to it and started letting him receive. And he looked at me with wide eyes and he said, "You don't realize what you have," because the receiver was so quiet compared to superhets of that day. And so he said, "You really need to pursue that." And so that was kind of the point at which I realized maybe there was something more to it than just a hobby project. So
let me interrupt you there. What was the aha moment like when you actually got your first sideband signal decoded? That must be amazing.
It really was, because I think it actually probably took me at least a couple of years to get that point where I could actually decode sideband, because I had to I hadn't done engineering in many years and didn't do much of it. So I had to learn everything from scratch, all the math. I had to do the coding, the hardware, all of those kind of things. So it took a lot of work. Spent many hours reading books and talking to people. And I had some really good mentors. Mike Penley and Ken Simmons over breakfast really helped me a lot in those early years. And so I owe a lot to them for kind of tutoring me along the way and telling me how dumb I was. And I just kept pursuing it. So, but that's serial number one right there.
It's amazing today, in today's world too. I mean, I can imagine what those boards cost to get run, the first couple, but and today for $20, you can have 5 boards built in about 4 days and delivered. And
yeah, I know. It was a little more than that. Actually, at that time, I had the surface mount parts put on in Bulgaria. The circuit boards were made in Bulgaria. And then this room that I'm in right now was actually converted into the FlexRadio lab. And we had as many as 4 people working in this room at that time, and shipping was upstairs in the game room. And the Flex 5000 was, the prototypes were covering the dining room table right out there. We had 10 prototypes of the Flex 5000, and they were there for a few months. And my wife looked at me and said, "Do you ever think that we'll ever get our dining room table back?" There was a day when that happened.
I'll bet. And
one more thing about this board, this first SDR 1000 is W5SXD. Is the person, he came to my doorstep and picked it up right here. And he said, "I'd like to write a CW keyer for the radio." And that's W5SXD wrote that keyer. And he's the one that traded it back to me years later. So
that's so cool. That's so amateur radio too. It's
yeah. There were quite a number of people that contributed to. In fact, we started having every Friday night there was a forum that turned into Open HPSDR. So many of the early adopters of the SDR 1000 would meet on every Friday night, and I would join them on a call. It was before we had Zoom, but it was audio. And through those conversations, the Open HPSDR was formed. So it came out of that. And of course, PowerSDR was adopted as the platform for doing that. But that came out of the early FlexRadio days.
Cool. Then we came up with the 1500, 3000, 5000, which was, the first real commercial jump, for the masses, so to speak, I guess.
Yeah, those were really the first true SDRs, not just DSP radios, but where 100% of the signal processing was done in a CPU, and that was done at that time using direct down conversion or direct conversion, where you go in a single step from RF down to in phase and quadrature signals at baseband, and those went into the sound card of a PC. So the original SDR1000 required a PC and a sound card in order to operate. And then later we integrated the sound card capabilities into the Flex 5000, 3000, and 1500. So those were later products. But interestingly enough, you were talking about the people that got involved. One of the first calls I got was from someone who wanted to use the SDR1000 in some pretty interesting applications for his work, which I won't go into the detail of. But he said, I'd like to help enhance and fund the DSP work on Power SDR, as long as you'll make it open source. And that was kind of the early days of Power SDR, which became kind of an industry standard for open source SDR work in those days.
Yeah, that's true. Even if you're using something as simple as a very inexpensive RTL dongle, some of that code exists in there, correct?
Yeah.
Even today.
Right. That's right. It's still around today.
And if you're using any of those 1500, 3000, 5000 radios, you're now probably using KE9NS's build of it.
That's right.
And he's done some cool things with it. It's really slick.
Yeah,
okay,
actually,
that brings us. Go ahead.
We partnered with KE9NS to ask if he would. We provided him the tools and the software and the equipment to allow him to continue to support the open source Power SDR, which he's continued to do.
Yeah, he's done a lot. Sorry, yeah, Kilo 9, November Sierra, right? Not Kilo Echo 9. Very good. Then that brings us to the 65, 67, 6300 series.
Yeah, to get there, I need to give you a little bit of history in terms of how there's been a correlation between amateur and commercial that we've seen through our entire history. You may or may not know that one of the core premises in the FCC Part 97 rules for amateur radio, I'll quote it, is continuation and extension of the amateur's proven ability to contribute to the advancement of the radio art. And that's one of the key tenets of amateur radio. And we've seen this throughout our history, is about how that amateurs have, since the very earliest days of radio, if you think about it, the first radio operators were amateurs. There were no commercial capabilities in radio. So it was the amateur or the ham that experimented and created and put on the air new capabilities in the radio art. And so this has been throughout the amateur radio history. In fact, we wouldn't know the way cell phones and GPSs work. They're hams that were integrally involved in the creation of those technologies, and we know some of those people. And that's been true across the board. So I mentioned that one of the first customers for the early SDR1000 wanted to use it for commercial applications. Later, we actually, with his company, built a coherent 32-channel receiver system and a direct sampling receiver system called CDRX and SERX in our vernacular. And those contracts that we got actually enhanced our capability as a company. The multi-channel receiver was actually the equivalent of 32 Flex 5000s in a 7U rack chassis, all coherent reception. And so we were able to take, technology from the 1000 into the 5000. That 5000 went into this coherent receiving system. And under the same contract, we did a direct sampling receiver, which used the same direct sampling chips that we use in our radios today. And so we were introduced to more sophisticated applications because of the ham radio connections, which created technology that we then rolled into the Flex 6000 series and Smart SDR. So the genesis of the 6000 and Smart SDR came out of those contracts that we got. Those were in the 2008 timeframe. And then in 2011 is when we started developing the Flex 6000 series. So that means 10 years ago is when we started development of Smart SDR and Flex 6000 series. And they came out of intellectual property and people that we were able to hire because of those contracts. So there's a continued evolution of that today. Just last week, we delivered on a major contract that we got 2 years ago that takes the 6000 series and Smart SDR and puts it into another capability for our government. So we've seen that cycle go around, and within that development, we've created new capabilities, hired new people, have more in technology as well as equipment and facilities that are all associated with that cycle from amateur to commercial to amateur to commercial.
That's pretty impressive. I wanted to just roll back on the 6000 series, and I think one of the greatest leapfrogs we ever made, probably Steve, Eric, yourself, and whoever was around that table, is eventually got a FireWire, which of course was the fastest thing back then. And once you put it on the LAN, the world opened. The radio is wide open, right, to do things with.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned something really key I want to go back to is about using Ethernet. In the earlier days, we were using FireWire, as you mentioned. And FireWire was fast, but it's a point-to-point system just between a physically connected point-to-point system. With Ethernet, you have a standard communications protocol, TCP/IP, that can be anywhere. It can be inside the box, inside the room, or the other side of the world, and it all communicates in the same way. And it's such an enormous standard that it's not going to go away. In my lifetime, certainly it won't go away. I doubt. So it was a really strategic move when we went to Ethernet protocol, and that came about through those the 2008 contracts that we got. That's where we developed all of our Ethernet protocols. They're based on VITA 49, which is a standard communications for SDR communications. So everything we do is based on that. Even inside of our radios, there's an Ethernet switch so that the FPGA, the CPU, all the outside world all communicate through an Ethernet switch that's built into the radio. So everything's Ethernet based. The second thing that was really important is when we developed Smart SDR, we took all of the learning to date about how SDRs should work, and we said, let's do it right. Let's start with a clean sheet of paper and have an architecture that can scale for the future. And we're seeing that scaling today, that we're able to do things that we couldn't even think of at the time we started, but yet the architecture supports those things that we couldn't think of at the time.
Was multiplex even a vision in those days? Had you considered multiple clients connecting to a radio in the early days, or did it just?
Actually, it was. That thought was there. Steve Hicks was very key to that, and Ed Gonzalez. But they did actually start to put it into the very early radios. But at some point, you have to kind of say, we need to stop for now and complete something. You can't add all the features on day one. And so that was definitely in the vision at that time, because the radio is a server. It incorporates a Linux server, and Linux by definition is multi-user. And so that concept was there from day one. The concept of having scalable multiple receivers was there from day one. And the idea of being able to put multiple digitizers, what we call spectral capture units, was there from day one. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, it's quite an advantage the way the hardware was designed to do that. And the other thing I'm going to applaud you for was the vision of not only remote operating, but the vision of SmartLink, where it is about as plug and play that you can get to, but also with the least latent way of doing it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
One thing you mentioned about what were we thinking of when we developed the 6000 series. If you go get a copy of the original Flex 6000 brochure, it was really a concept brochure that said, what if you could do all of these things? And what's interesting is you go back and I think we've done every one of them that we had in that vision brochure, which we introduced in Dayton of 2012 was when we first showed off the Flex 6000 series, and we said, here are all the things that you could do, and we've delivered on all of those.
I bought a 6300, carried it home that day, and at Dayton, it was, that's when I remember asking Steve, what can I do with this LAN connector? And Steve sort of knew who I was. I was just another vocal customer who liked the product and saw the vision. And he goes, anything you want. And of course, that's true, right, on the LAN connector. And now we see so many of our customers, I don't need the radio on the desk. It's in the other room. It's at the base of the tower. LAN cable's a lot cheaper than running 6 runs of, LMR 400 for 50 feet or 70 feet or a couple hundred feet. And you can move the radio further away from the noise. So,
well, another thing is that I'm sure you remember is that at one time, the vision of having an Ethernet-based shack where the whole shack is connected by Ethernet, that was a vision that not too long ago, but it's fully a reality now, right? You're doing that in your shack.
We're doing that in so many, and that'll be my QSO Today talk. We'll be highlighting some of the. I'm really a big fan of the death of the RS-232 port, and FireWire was no different. It's a point-to-point communications protocol, so it very limits what you can do. So, and us hams, we're stubborn at times, and we love old technology, and so we get those differences. But that's cool. There's just the beauty of ham radio as a hobby. So. You had mentioned, I think we chatted earlier about the, do you want to talk a little bit more about your flywheel concept?
Oh, yeah. And I was alluding to that a few minutes ago, the idea that amateur feeds commercial, which feeds amateur, which feeds commercial. And this is a flywheel. If you think about it, when you spin up a flywheel, it has momentum. And that momentum is created by in the concept I'm talking about here is technology and capabilities that we develop for the amateur community were seen by literally hams that work in the commercial and government community. And in almost every case, there's a ham that is familiar with the amateur marketplace and sees the SDR capability that we've developed and says, I bet we could use this for X, Y, and Z at work. And they come to us with those, could you take your product and do X, Y, and Z? Many times they actually take the product as is and use it as is for special applications outside of amateur radio. And one of the key things we did with Smart SDR is that we we integrated, and this once again was Steve's vision, a open API, which means everything in the radio can be controlled and accessed through an API, so that third-party developers can use that to develop specialized applications, including waveforms. The ability to create a waveform and run it either externally or inside the radio through a standard API. And there are now, I think, probably at least a couple of hundred developers that have used that API in some fashion. Some were serious about it, some were just playing with it. And those are across both amateur, commercial, and government applications. And once again, it's hands at work that are seeing what these radios can do and then applying them at work. And through those, we've been successful in landing major contracts for government and commercial that increase our capabilities. And those will flow back as the flywheel spins, those will flow back into the amateur world, just as they have since day one. I mentioned one of the first 50 radios went into an application that was outside of the amateur world, and those applications flowed in and have cycled around time after time after time. So it's pretty amazing the capabilities we've been able to build on over these years that will cycle back into amateur, which will cycle back into commercial again. And I don't want to underestimate the fact that hams work in real jobs and real companies and within the government, et cetera. And so they've been a connector for us throughout the years.
There's been, there isn't a ham I know. It said, I love this radio, but it'd be great if it did X. And this now gives them the ability to get to X. And it might be a specialized part of the hobby. Maybe you're into high microwave transverter things. All those hooks and, these hooks and APIs are all there that you could customize it for your shack and your particular workflow. We see so much now of that happening. I'm sure there's a ton of it in the commercial world we don't even hear about. We know in the amateur world, we've seen programs like Slice Master, FR Stack, and then all the personal stuff that guys like Dave, WO2X, and Alan Blind have done in the Node Red world, where they can, I can just get my shack working exactly the way I want it, not the way somebody else thought. And we've had talks on that before, and then that coupled with your remote station just makes it so seamless. And COVID really drove that home when a lot of people were either working at home or or the contesting started to have to be that the operators were remote. And it took them a while to catch up, but we've seen some pretty amazing scores in some late contests last year where the operators were distributed all over the place, and they didn't have to grab a plane.
Yeah, I also have to talk about the fact that many times I go to meet with people, companies, et cetera, and if I want to do a demo, I bring out my iPad and log into our show password, and there are usually at least a half dozen radios on there, and I can demo a Smart SDR. I did it literally yesterday driving between Macon, Georgia, and Atlanta. Demoed to someone Smart SDR running from the car, and that was developed by a third party. So think of the capabilities of that.
Yeah, that's a Smart SDR for iOS. And
that's
by the way, I think Marcus, we have a talk in QSO Today from Marcus on that product as well. So you'll have to find that and watch that one. It's very well done. I think Marcus also owns a Tesla. So I wouldn't doubt that he's trying to get it loaded somehow on a Tesla. But he's a pretty resourceful and very smart person.
Yeah.
So that's and we all see that. So that's a wonderful part of that's the part of the integrator in me that I really love to see. And so we're right now at this point in time, we're at the end of what we think of roughly is wave 3, and hopefully there's not a wave 4 of COVID, and that's obviously impacted everybody worldwide in business. We've had to adapt.
Yeah, as COVID hit the world, everybody had to adapt, and there's some really good things that came out of it for us. One is we learned how to work remotely as a company. And what that opened up to us is that we could actually hire some people that we wouldn't otherwise hire, key people, because they don't always want to move. And so we were able to hire and integrate key engineering talent outside of Austin, Texas, and integrate them in very well into the culture of the company and being very productive. So that was a key thing that came out of it. And as you can see, I'm still working from home. And I think that we'll continue to see the hybrid work environment over time. And one of the nice things, too, with hams is that it's a dream job to work in a ham radio company for many people. And so it's opened the door for us to recruit and hire hams in other parts of the country and make them feel part of the team, because if one person's on remote, we're all on remote, and that makes it easier. So that's been a good thing. The other thing is we had in the late 2019, before COVID, we had moved toward configure to order manufacturing with a contract manufacturer, and we were just getting that set up when COVID hit. And within a few weeks of the time COVID hit, our manufacturer, which was in San Antonio, Texas, about 90 miles from Austin, said that we're going to shut our San Antonio facility and move it to Mexico, move everything to Mexico. And they wanted us to move to Mexico. And we didn't want to build in Mexico. We wanted to build in the United States. For multiple reasons. And also, Mexico's a little harder to get to than San Antonio or across Austin. And so we bit the bullet and said, we're going to move final assembly in-house at FlexRadio. And we're going to bring the board assembly, the circuit board assembly, back to Austin. And so we actually went back to the company that built the SDR 1000, 1500, 3000, and 5000. They're located 10 minutes drive from our office. And so they're building our circuit boards again. And then we moved in all of the final assembly and test in-house. We gutted, nobody had offices at the time, so we gutted all the internal offices in one of our buildings. We have 2 buildings now. And turn that into final assembly. And so as of about, 2 months ago, we reached full configure to order, which means there's a screen on the wall. And if you hit the button to say buy on our website, that shows up on the screen. And in order of as the orders come in, they configure those radios, put them in final test, and then burn in the radios configured to order. So, for example, if you order a GPS on it, or extended transmit, or an ATU on a 6400, those get configured at final assembly and test and go on to burn in. And so we can, within a couple of days from the time of order, have them out. So this is a major capability so that we don't have too much stock in one thing and not enough stock in another thing. It's helped out greatly in that area.
It's been pretty fun to watch, and I'm going to bring up the video you showed. I don't have a copy of it because I don't want to release it, but we have meetings every Friday, and Gerald shows this video of us testing the packaging in a 6600M box. And do you want to describe it, or should I?
Yeah, so one of our guys, Paul, says, I'm going to play the truck driver, and he gets on the back dock, and he throws the box as far as he can throw it in the parking lot. And it survived, right? So we're testing new packaging.
There's a radio in it. Now, granted, it was a
Yeah.
dead, probably hit by lightning radio. It didn't matter, but we're looking for cables popping off or the display cracking or
Knobs being,
knobs
yeah,
being bent and stuff. So,
yeah,
we actually consider all this stuff before we ship stuff all over the world. It's actually,
right.
I'm actually blown away. If you never think of it for a minute, how each phase is incredibly critical and takes a lot of thought, from quick start guides to packaging. So that's why you'll notice every radio gets double boxed, and they're just really well done. So what do you what's on the future? We're just going to wrap up here. What's on the future for Gerald? I mean, I'm sure you're going to want to start to put your feet up at least one day a week. Is that even possible? Or do you even know yet?
So everybody asked when are you going to retire, and I said, how do you spell that? I don't know. It would be nice to get a Saturday off sometime. That would be nice.
Yeah, well, hopefully soon with that one project relaxed a bit.
Yeah.
But
yeah. So,
well,
it's nice to love what you do and love the people you work with and be doing things that people enjoy. It's so fun to get, how this is, Mike, to get an email from someone who has really thoroughly enjoyed the product that you make, because that's what makes it all worthwhile.
yeah, I get a lot of those emails, and sometimes I feel like I'm bombarding the company, but I send them out to the entire staff. Your radio is the best radio I've ever owned, or I've had an issue where I'm stuck somewhere, but I'm still on the air. Or you get the idea, and keep them coming. Believe me, there's a lot of, you almost went up 4 times in staff probably through COVID, and
Right.
some people aren't hams. They understand the technology, but they then got to see what we actually do to the radio. And I think John, we blew him away going, some of the stuff what you guys do with radios and how we integrate it. So we are very happy to hear those and get those anytime. So feel free to share them with us. Gerald, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out of an incredibly busy couple of weeks, or probably a couple of years, and to spend a few minutes to talk to everybody and to bring them up to speed on the company. And usually you'd have a discussion like this at Dayton. We haven't had a Dayton or Xenia for a while, and so maybe we'll catch up with a lot of you at the next one, but this will fill the gap.
Yeah, I really miss getting to see people face to face in person. Hopefully that day will come soon for all of us.
Absolutely. Very good. Well, 73, everybody. And there's a number, by the way, of one more great talk you want to look for is, I don't know, Gerald, if you even know this, but Dave Hirschberger is going to talk about controlled envelope single sideband. What a powerful tool embedded in the radio.
We were really fortunate to be able to work with Dave and integrate that into our radios as the first place that it was ever implemented. And it works extremely well.
Really well. 73, everybody.
73.